The end of the world didn't begin with a bang, it began with a signature on a train car in a French forest. On November 11, 1918, the guns of World War I fell silent for the German Empire. It was a catastrophic, unexpected defeat. For 4 years, the government had told its people they were winning. They had financed the most expensive war in human history, not with taxes, but with debt, promising the German people that the defeated enemy would pay the bill. But now, Germany was the defeated enemy. The Kaiser fled into exile, the empire collapsed into revolution and street fighting. Out of this chaos, a fragile, unwanted democracy was born, the Weimar Republic. This new government inherited a financial corpse. The war debt was staggering, the economy was shattered, millions of men were returning from the trenches, looking for work that didn't exist. But the true nightmare was just beginning in Paris at the peace conference. The victorious Allies, led by France, wanted revenge. They wanted to ensure Germany could never threaten them again. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just redraw the map, it drafted a financial death sentence. Germany was forced to sign Article 231. The War Guilt Clause, accepting full responsibility for the conflict. This was the legal basis for reparations. The Allies demanded that Germany pay for the entire cost of the war. The final figure was set at 132 billion gold marks. It was a number so large it was meaningless. It was designed not to be paid, but to crush the German economy for generations. Crucially, these reparations had to be paid in gold or foreign currency, like the US dollar or the British pound. The Allies would not accept German paper money because they knew what was coming. The new Weimar government faced an impossible choice: to pay the reparations and the war pensions for millions of wounded veterans and widows. They needed massive amounts of money. A strong government might have raised taxes, they could have confiscated the wealth of the aristocracy or the war profiteers, but the Weimar government was weak. It was terrified of a communist revolution, like the one that had just happened in Russia. Taxing the rich or the workers too heavily might trigger a civil war, so they chose the path of least resistance, the path that politicians have chosen for centuries. When faced with insurmountable debt, they turned on the printing presses. At first, it didn't seem so bad. During the war, the government had already detached the German mark from the gold standard to finance the fighting. In 1914, $1 bought about 4 German marks. By the end of the war in 1918, $1 bought 8 marks. Inflation was already there, eating away at wages, but it was manageable. Life was hard, but it was functioning. The government printed money to pay its own domestic bills, the salaries of teachers, police officers, and bureaucrats. They used this newly printed paper to buy foreign currency on the open market to pay the reparations. Throughout 1919 and 1920, the presses ran a little faster every month. As more paper marks flooded the system, their value decreased, so the government had to print even more to buy the same amount of gold. It was a slow downward spiral. By 1921, the exchange rate had slipped to 60 marks to the dollar, then 90, then 300. German prices started to rise noticeably. Bread became more expensive every few months. Savings accounts that had taken a lifetime to build started to buy less and less. There was grumbling in the beer halls and bread lines, but there was still faith in the currency. A mark was still a mark. The government tried to negotiate. They begged the Allies for a moratorium, a pause in the payments, so the economy could recover. The British were sympathetic, realizing that a bankrupt Germany couldn't buy British goods, but the French were adamant. They had borrowed heavily from America to fight the war, and they needed German cash to repay their own debts. They wanted their money, or they wanted blood. By the end of 1922, Germany missed a delivery of telegraph poles and coal as part of its reparations payment. It was a minor default, but France used it as a pretext. The French Prime Minister, Raymond Poincaré, decided that if Germany wouldn't pay, France would take payment by force. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into Germany. They didn't march on Berlin, they marched on the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was the industrial heart of Germany. It contained the coal mines, the steel mills, and the factories that powered the entire nation. The French plan was simple: they would occupy the mines and factories, seize the coal and steel directly, and ship it back to France as reparations. It was an act of war in peacetime. The German army, reduced to a police force by the Treaty of Versailles, could do nothing to stop them. The German Government was outraged, but powerless. They couldn't fight back militarily, so they decided to fight back economically. They decided to launch the most expensive act of defiance in history. The government in Berlin ordered a policy of passive resistance. They told the coal miners, the steel workers, and the railway men of the Ruhr to stop working down tools. Do not dig a single lump of coal for the French general strike. It was a wave of patriotic fervor. The industrial heart of Europe stopped beating. The French soldiers found themselves guarding silent factories and empty mines. But there was a massive problem with this strategy. There were millions of workers in the Ruhr. If they weren't working, they weren't getting paid. How would they eat? How would their families survive? The German government made a promise. They declared that Berlin would pay the wages of every single striking worker in the Ruhr. They would pay them to do nothing, just to spite the French. Where would the government get the money to pay millions of people to sit idle? The printing presses in Berlin roared to life. They weren't just printing a little extra now. They were about to unleash a financial tidal wave that would drown the entire nation. The decision to pay the striking workers in the Ruhr with printed money was the spark that ignited the inferno. Before 1923, Germany had high inflation. After January 1923, they entered the realm of madness, hyperinflation. Economically, it was the perfect storm. On one side, the government was pumping billions of new paper marks into the economy every week to pay the striking workers. The money supply was exploding. On the other side, because the industrial heartland of the Ruhr had stopped working, the supply of actual goods, coal, steel, manufactured products, collapsed. You had vast amounts of new money chasing fewer and fewer goods. The result was instant, catastrophic price rises. The basic laws of economics asserted themselves with brutal vengeance. As soon as the new paper money hit the streets, shopkeepers knew it was worth less than the money from yesterday, so they raised prices. The workers, seeing prices rise, demanded higher wages just to buy food. The government, desperate to keep the peace, printed more money to pay those higher wages. The vicious cycle began to spin faster and faster. In January 1923, $1 bought 18,000 marks. By April, it was 24,000. By June, 100,000. The currency began to lose its function as a store of value. If you held onto a mark for a week, it lost half its purchasing power. This changed human behavior instantly. A new phenomenon emerged: the flight from currency. As soon as people got paid, they ran, literally ran, to the nearest store to buy anything they could find. It didn't matter if you needed a new pair of shoes or a sack of potatoes. You bought them because they were physical objects that would hold some value, whereas the paper in your pocket was rotting by the hour. The velocity of money, the speed at which cash moves through the economy, hit warp speed. Money was like a hot potato. Nobody wanted to hold it for more than a few minutes. By the summer of 1923, the numbers were getting silly. The government couldn't print the notes fast enough. The imperial printing office was running 24 hours a day, employing tens of thousands of people just to cut and stack paper. They started outsourcing the printing to private companies. Soon, over 130 different printing companies across Germany were churning out banknotes. They couldn't design new plates fast enough to keep up with the zeros. They started taking old 1,000 mark notes and just stamping 1 million over the old number in red ink. The exchange rate plunged into the abyss. In July, one bought 350,000 marks. In August, it was 46 million. The banking system began to break down. Banks didn't have enough vault space to store the physical volume of paper needed for everyday transactions. People started carrying money in backpacks, then suitcases, and finally wheelbarrows. There is a famous dark joke from this time of a man who took a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. He left the wheelbarrow outside the bakery for a moment. When he came back out, someone had dumped the money on the street and stolen the wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow was real wealth. The paper was trash. The social fabric of Germany began to tear apart. The people who were hit hardest were the people who had done everything right according to the old rules. The middle class, the savers, the pensioners, people who had worked for 40 years and saved a nest egg for their retirement, watched their entire life savings vanish in a matter of weeks. A bank account that could have bought a house in 1921 could not buy a postage stamp. By late 1923, widows living on fixed war pensions, starved landlords who had rented out properties on long-term leases found that the monthly Rent wasn't enough to buy a single egg, but while the prudent were punished, the gamblers were rewarded, borrowers wiped out their debts for pennies. If you had borrowed 5 million marks in 1922 to buy a factory by the summer of 1923, you could pay off that entire loan by selling a single teacup. Industrialists and speculators who understood what was happening borrowed massive amounts of paper money to buy real assets, land, mines, machines, knowing they could repay the loans later with money that was effectively worthless. Men like Hugo Stinnes, the inflation king, built massive industrial empires for free, buying up bankrupt competitors with borrowed paper. The rich got obscenely rich, while the middle class fell into poverty. Society turned upside down. Traditional values of hard work and thrift were exposed as cruel jokes. Why work a 12-hour day when your entire week's wages wouldn't buy a tram ticket home? Crime exploded. Farmers guarded their potato fields with shotguns because city dwellers were streaming into the countryside to steal food. Barter returned. Doctors were paid in sausages and coal. Needles and thread became more valuable than stacks of 1,000-mark notes. By September 1923, the slide turned into a freefall. The exchange rate hit 100 million marks to the dollar. The government in Berlin was losing control of the country. Communist uprisings broke out in Hamburg and Saxony. Separatist movements flared in the Rhineland. The French were still in the Ruhr, squeezing the economy. The printing presses were melting down and winter was coming. By the autumn of 1923, Germany had entered the realm of the surreal. The numbers had lost all connection to reality. In October, the exchange rate was $1 to 25 billion marks. By November, it was $1 to 42 trillion marks. Life became a dark, absurdist comedy. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A single egg cost 80 billion. Prices were rising not by the month or the week, but by the hour. There's a famous anecdote of a man who went into a cafe for a coffee. The price on the menu was 5,000 marks. He drank the coffee. When the waiter brought the bill 30 minutes later, the price was 8,000 marks. The currency had depreciated in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. Workers demanded to be paid daily, then twice daily. Wives would meet their husbands at the factory gates at lunchtime to take sacks of cash and rush to the shops before the afternoon price doubling. The physical reality of the money became a problem. The notes were just paper. They had no value. People began to use them for anything other than commerce. The winter of 1923 was cold. Coal was scarce because of the French occupation of the Ruhr. People looked at the stacks of billion-mark notes in their homes, realizing they couldn't buy coal with them, so they did the logical thing. They threw the money into the stove. It was cheaper to burn stacks of cash for heat than to use that cash to buy firewood. Children used bundles of banknotes as building blocks. Others cut them up to use as toilet paper or wallpapered their rooms with them. The German mark, once a symbol of imperial strength, was literally trash. The psychological impact was devastating. It was a collective trauma that scarred a generation. A society relies on trust in the future. Money is a contract with the future. You work today because you believe the money you earn will be worth something tomorrow. When that trust vanishes, civilization reverts to a primal state. Desperation set in. The death rate among infants and the elderly soared due to malnutrition and lack of heat. Tuberculosis spread through the crowded, unheated tenements. Suicide rates spiked. People who saw their entire existence invalidated, who could not feed their children despite working themselves to the bone, simply gave up in this atmosphere of total chaos. Political extremism flourished. When the mainstream system fails so completely, people begin to listen to voices from the fringe, voices that offer simple solutions and clear enemies to blame. The communists screamed that this was the inevitable end, failure of capitalism. They argued that the only solution was to tear down the system and build a Soviet Germany. On the far right, new violent voices were emerging. They blamed the inflation not on printing money, but on the November criminals who signed the Treaty of Versailles. They blamed the Jews. They blamed the international bankers in Bavaria. A virtually unknown agitator named Adolf Hitler was gathering strength in the beer halls of Munich. He watched the chaos in Berlin with glee. He knew that hungry, angry, desperate people were ripe for radicalization. He told Krauss that the Weimar democracy was a puppet of foreign powers, deliberately destroying the German people. He promised to restore order. He promised to make Germany strong again to a middle class that had just been pauperized by democratic incompetence. His message began to resonate by November 1923. The situation was terminal, the government could not continue. The game was up on November 8. Adolf Hitler made his move. He fired a pistol into the ceiling of a Munich beer hall and declared a national revolution. The Surreal beer hall putsch. He intended to march on Berlin and seize power, mimicking Mussolini's march on Rome. The year before, the coup was poorly organized. Bavarian police opened fire on the Nazis. The next day Hitler fled, dislocating his shoulder, and was eventually arrested for high treason. The immediate threat of a Nazi takeover was crushed. But while the political coup failed, the economic crisis had reached its absolute limit. The printing presses physically could not print zeros fast enough to keep up with prices. The entire economic machinery of a modern industrial nation had ground to a complete halt. Germany was on the brink of total disintegration. Something had to change instantly, or the country would cease to exist. In the darkest hour of November 1923, with Hitler in jail and the economy dead, a new government took charge in Berlin. It was led by a pragmatic chancellor named Gustav Stresemann. Stresemann knew that to save Germany, he had to do the unpopular thing. He had to stop the bleeding. His first move was political. He called off the passive resistance. In the Ruhr, he told the workers to go back to work. It was a humiliation, an admission that France had won the standoff. Nationalists screamed traitor, but Stresemann knew the country could not survive if it kept paying millions of people to do nothing. His second move was financial. He brought in a brilliant, arrogant financial wizard named Hjalmar Schacht to fix the currency. Schacht knew that the paper mark was beyond saving. Trust was gone. You couldn't just stop printing and expect people to start using it again. They needed a new currency, but what would back this new currency? Germany had no gold. The Allies had taken it all. So Schacht performed a psychological magic trick. On November 15, 1923, he introduced the Rentenmark. He announced that this new currency was backed not by gold, but by the real estate and agricultural land of Germany itself. The government took out a theoretical mortgage on every farm and factory in the nation to back the new notes. Economically, this was smoke and mirrors. If the currency failed, the government couldn't actually seize every farm in Germany and sell it, but psychologically, it worked. The German people, desperate for stability, chose to believe in it. Schacht set the exchange rate. One new Rentenmark was worth 1 trillion old paper marks. Crucially, Schacht did the one thing previous governments refused to do. He stopped the printing presses. He declared that the supply of Rentenmarks was strictly limited. The government could no longer print money to pay its bills. If the government didn't have tax revenue, it couldn't spend. It was brutal shock therapy. The government slashed spending. They fired roughly 25 of all civil servants. They raised taxes. The miracle of the Rentenmark happened almost overnight. Prices stopped rising. Food reappeared in the shops because farmers were willing to trade their produce for money that held its value. The wheelbarrows disappeared. The hyperinflation was over. The fever had broken. Germany entered a period known as the Golden Twenties. American banks, seeing stability return, began lending massive amounts of money to Germany under the Dawes Plan. This American cash helped Germany pay its reparations to France and Britain, and funded a brief economic boom. Berlin became the cultural capital of Europe, famous for its cabaret, art, and science. It seemed like the Ruhr Republic had survived. But the patient had not recovered. It had merely stabilized. The economic crisis was over, but the psychological damage was permanent. The stabilization of 1923 had stopped the chaos, but it cemented the losses. If you had had a savings account worth 50,000 marks in 1918, enough for a comfortable retirement, when you exchanged it in December 1923, you received a fraction of a single Rentenmark. Pfennig. Your life savings couldn't buy a crumb of bread. The middle class had been expropriated. They felt betrayed by democracy. They had followed the rules, saved their money, and been loyal citizens. And the democratic government had robbed them of everything. Meanwhile, the debtors, the speculators, and the war profiteers got to keep their ill-gotten gains. The injustice of it burned into the soul of the German middle class. This lingering resentment was the toxic soil in which the seeds of the future were planted. When Adolf Hitler emerged from prison a year later, he found a changed country. The immediate crisis had passed. People were working again. His radical message didn't resonate as strongly during the stable years of the late 1920s. The Nazi Party remained on the fringe, but the trust in the system was gone. The German people now knew that their government was capable of destroying their livelihood overnight through incompetence. They knew that democracy could mean starvation and chaos. The Weimar Republic was living on borrowed time and borrowed American money. It was a house built on a cracked foundation. The hyperinflation of 1923 didn't put Hitler into power immediately, but it destroyed the immune system of German society. It weakened the middle class that should have been the bulwark against extremism. So when the next crisis hit, the Great Depression in 1929, when the American loans dried up and unemployment soared again, the German people had no reserves of patience left. They remembered the wheelbarrows of 1923. They remembered burning cash for heat. And this time, when a man with a funny mustache promised to burn the whole system down and build a new order of strength and stability, they didn't just listen, they voted for him.